Good evening. Is Guyana in the process of creating a four-tiered education system? Let's look at what happened over the past couple of weeks. Satisfaction about the outstanding performance of some of our students at the CXC was quickly tempered by the failure of the majority of our students in English and maths. In maths, the failure rate was around 70%, and in English, over 54%. But what did we hear from the Ministry of Education charged with responsibility to ensure that our system delivers quality education to all Guyanese? It concentrated on 231 students who secured 8 or more grade 1 passes. They, it seemed, are more important than the 16,000 who failed English. Not French or Spanish, but the English, the only language we speak. But 2013 is not an aberration. It has been so for years, and we recall promises made by former Education Minister Sheikh Baksh to significantly improve the quality of output of the system. What is clear is that we have not achieved that quality, and we have a serious long-term problem. There is no simple solution. We still spend about the lowest amount per child in public education in the Caribbean. We pay teachers only paltry salaries and offer them conditions that are hardly any better. Our graduates leave as soon as they can. We need to do some serious analysis and reflection on this education system. And equally urgently, in my view, is a gap which is developing between the quality of private and public schools. What I have found missing in the otherwise informative debate on the results of these exams is an analysis of the performance and failure by private versus public schools, indeed by individual schools. My fear is that public schools in both urban and rural areas are underperforming compared with the private schools. That kind of information needs to be published and discussed widely. I fear that it would show that education, the foundation of even a modestly successful life, is determined not by the child's ability, but by whether his or her parent can afford private education. Whether this is an intended consequence of the reintroduction of private schools is debatable. But let us recognize that in numerical terms, students in private schools account for a small percentage of the student population in the education system. I think we need a national debate on how to solve the problem of education from nursery to university as guaranteed by our Constitution. My name is Christopher Ram. Welcome to Plain Talk. A couple of weeks ago, commentator, literary writer, editorial consultant, and journalist Ruel Johnson published 2 books, collected poems and fictions. The launch of itself was quite interesting, featuring not only the books or their writer, but some young Guyanese in music, poetry, and writing. So I have on Plain Talk this evening the author and 2 of the persons, the author Mr. Ruel Johnson, and 2 of the persons featured on the night of the launch, Ms. Chricell Whitney and Ms. Sara Bharrat. Welcome all to Play Blog.
Thank you. Good evening.
Just before we started this segment, I discussed, I raised my views about the state of education in Guyana. You yourself, I know, are at the University of Guyana, all you young people, writers. What's the state of education in Guyana?
Well, I probably should bring you some feedback directly from the classroom. So I am a part of the Education and Humanities faculty, which means that a lot of my English classes would contain teachers, and these are the people educating our children. And you've got our English teachers struggling with things as simple as grammar, spelling, punctuation, of course, which is included in grammar. So this says to me, this is the quality available to our children. These are the providers of education. So what is the education system like?
Well, as a student myself, I have to agree with Ms. Sara, because I have experienced the same thing in my classroom, because I am also a student of the university.
Which year? And which department?
So this is social sciences.
Yes.
And so I have different people in my classroom, from teachers to professionals and so on. And I find that a lot of us are struggling with the English, especially because if you were to go to a first year ENG class at the university, English class at the university, you find that a lot of adults are not aware of basic English, and so they find a lot of adults are not coping very well with the syllabus. So ENG has a very high failure rate at the university. So it's not just CXC failing; it's even at the university, students are finding it very hard to cope with English.
Well, you've just come back from Suriname. English is a second language.
Yeah.
In some cases, it's third language for some of the people.
Yeah.
They seem to speak better English than we do.
Yeah. I can give an anecdotal reference to how books are treated here. Even though my books, which I sold across, are written in English, I had a far more welcome in terms of sales, actual sales, from Suriname than we've had in Guyana, ironically. And these are people who, again, English may be, as you said, is second or third language, because Dutch, some speak French because they're close to French Guyana as well.
Some speak Hindi.
Hindi. In fact, there are varieties of languages that they speak. Varieties of Dutch, for example. Was it Surinamese or something like that? But there is a deliberate focus on language education, I think, that seems missing here. They have an education system that codifies in law how language is presented. There are certain documents that have to be, by law, written in certain languages. We don't have this other system here.
You yourself are a writer, and we mentioned, I mean, there's one student who got 20 subjects. That's almost incredible.
Yeah.
Almost incredible. How do we produce a handful of outstanding people? Is it that they would have been outstanding wherever they went? Ruel Johnson is a writer. Yeah. I mean, a pretty good writer, I would say. What causes that? We have a few, but the majority are.
I think the exam system has become sort of a mill to churn out the graduates, and that's basically it. And the people, as the achievement is incidental. Eventually, if it is that you refine a system of churning out people who graduate with more and more subjects, there are going to be the few exceptions. Again, what you're missing is the 16,000 out of how much? that fail.
7 or something like that.
Yes. That's the majority of who fail English.
That would be considered a disaster, isn't it? You take a whole, from what age they were in school, from about 5 years, this is about 16, 17, they're writing exams.
But again,
that is what the whole education system leads to, and then to work. And you fail?
Yeah, this is it. For me, it's a couple of things. One is the education system as a whole, but it also has to do with how language is currently evolving with regard to technology, etc., in which language is shifting, and how people communicate. A simpler thing as the ubiquity of cell phones with the text message format and the shortened format of English, the Twitter and all that. There's no stricture. There is no system of rules that you grow up in. Coming from a society, by the way, in which most of us don't speak standard English in our day-to-day lives, myself included. You add all those factors together. You add the fact that there's the issue of relevance, and that's why I believe that literature, specifically, but also contextually relevant texts, have a role to play in the education system, in the sense that if it is that students can't identify with the books they're reading, for example, and this is something that came out last year during the CXC launch here, if it is they can't identify with characters or they can't identify with situations presented in the text, then they don't associate with the words in the text.
But I don't necessarily believe that. Now, you're much, 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 much younger than I am. Mm-hmm. Well, we used to read Shakespeare. We read the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. You read all those books centuries and centuries earlier.
Yes.
Yeah.
We didn't identify with Master Willie and Percy the Chick. But yet, for some reason, I don't think we were that bad.
In a way, you would have, in the sense that the symbols and the memes of the colonial society might not have directly reflected those things, but that ethos, but it focused on an approximation of that. We don't have the sort of approximation now. The approximation, the closest approximation we have, ironically, is a different type of imperialism, cultural imperialism from the US, and the entertainment industry, etc. We could more identify with that. What we don't identify with is the world that exists in books, as represented by anybody, any even contemporary writers. Because if there's the issue of language, for example. Literary books aren't written. Books that have depth and meaning and that are part of the syllabus, or hopefully have depth and part of the syllabus. There isn't a direct connection. And I write now, and I think I'm fairly good at it. But I got a 3 in CXC literature. A grade 3. Not I didn't know books, not I wasn't interested in books. But every time I went into the classroom, I couldn't identify with the books. Even books that now, afterwards, like, for example, Toni Morrison's Jazz, which I did for, I think it was A levels. I didn't get it. I couldn't connect to the book, as probably I can now with far more experience. And I think it's the same thing that happens with students across the Caribbean. Not just Guyana. It's just I think we represent a low end of it, but I think it's region-wide, to be fair.
Now, since this program is not entirely about education, I will in fact be having Henry Jeffrey, former Minister of Education, on the program next week. The question of different streams of education, private schools and public schools, we call them, I think government schools. Would you recommend to anybody to send the children to government schools?
Well, it is debatable. It depends on how you look at it. Some people would opt for public schools because, of course, not everyone can afford to send their child to a public school. But in advising someone whether or not to go private or public, it depends on the way that you look at it. But for me, if I was to make a decision whether or not to send my child to public or private, I would go with private. Not to.
Why is that?
not to discriminate against public schools, but in private school, you get a sense of that attention. You get the sense of it's going to be a better environment for your child. The teachers are going to pay your children a little bit more attention because there's that direct connection with you and the teacher, and the teachers are much more inclined to be attentive to your child in a private school as against a public school, and I say that from experience.
Sarah, would you recommend private school over public? Assuming the money is not a factor, you can afford either one.
I am already in the other side of the fence. I would go with public. The reason is this: socialization plays a very big part in education. If you're not properly socialized, you're in big trouble.
You mean socialize into the violence in some of our urban schools?
You can't say all government schools.
I said in some. I said
in some, right?
Some.
Again, the environment, it would depend. But I'll give you an example, and let's try to be optimistic in this regard. I attended St. Stanislaus College, and I was there from 2000 to 2007. And during those years at a public school, and yes, it's a grade A, I believe they call it public school, I had attention, I had security, I was not exposed to violence.
Of course, they're probably one of the top 5 or 6 schools.
Yes.
We're talking about the primary. If you had to make that decision about a primary school.
If I had a child and I had to make that decision about a primary school, I would not send my child to a primary school.
Public school. Well, I can actually. My plan. My son goes to private school. My plan is to send him to a public school for secondary education, and it has more to do for me with the socialization aspect. I want him to be. And this is related in the sense that I went to public school that is very much in the news now, President's College, and I prefer him to. If there's the implication that private schools represent some sort of privilege, elitism, for the socialization aspect, that's not something I want him to. I want to give him as strong a foundation as possible, and I felt at the time, and I think I feel slightly vindicated, that the primary level, the private school system is better, but for the socialization and the grounding, I prefer that he go to public school in which he can mix people of all backgrounds. And I'm not a wealthy person, but at the same time, I don't want him to develop a sense of elitism that I go to a private school while others go to a public one.
This problem, and its services, especially this time, not only because schools are about to reopen, but because exam results come out. What's the trend like in education? Do you want to start this time, Chricell?
The trend in education, as far as the secondary trend in education, it's evident that the students in the secondary schools are struggling with the math and English, and I think that something decisive needs to be done. It is good that a few students can achieve 20 subjects, 18 subjects, and ace English and maths with a distinction or a grade 1, but there is this vast majority of students that are struggling with the math and English, and somebody needs to do something.
Who's that somebody?
Well, of course, starting with our Minister of Education, starting with the relevant authorities, persons that are responsible, persons that actually care and want something to change. We need to at least look into why this is happening, whether it be maybe the teaching approach is not sufficient for certain children, whether it be certain children are just not being adequately equipped to come to a classroom and actually learn actually be involved in what is being taught because of whatever struggles that they might be going through at home or in the classroom or in the school. But we need to look into to some sort of solution, something that can aid our children to do better, perform better, and so that everybody, not just a few persons, will be able to come out on top, but at least every child after sitting an exam would be confident that, well, I did my best and I got the best out of it.
Before we came in from you talked about the PS, the Chief Education Officer, Mr. Atusam. I think he was he was critical of somebody, he was criticizing someone who had written adversely. Do you get the impression that the Ministry of Education appreciates the gravity of the problem? And perhaps you could thank your President's College. You saw what the Minister of Education said. Oh, we are all in support of President's College.
I could put a disclaimer and say that Priya's a good friend of mine. But that's it. I think there's been a reactionary defensiveness when it comes to the state of education, which...
you mean denial by Ms. Manichan and her ministry?
Denial? Most likely, in the sense that, and we when it comes to politics, we may need to recognize that a public denial or public deniability may not necessarily mean that there's a private denial.
Let's be serious about this.
Yeah.
This is not politics we play.
No,
We're talking about education.
No, but again...
We're talking about education you're talking about the future of this country.
Of course, but
it's built on education.
Yeah, what I think that needs to be done is that, I see APNU has called for a commission of inquiry into educational crisis, etc. I think that, however you term it, I think there needs to be some sort of broad-based commission into the state of education in general, whether you want to use it as a crisis or not. Go into it objectively saying, these are the numbers. We recognize that some of them are troubling, but we also want to have a broad review of the education system overall. From the textbook issue, which was something last year, how do we get more relevant, cheap texts into the school system, and how do we incorporate technology? The one laptop per family issue was supposed to be an education-based initiative. That aspect of it has never taken off. It's never. There's been nothing. There's been no portal, for example, in which OLPF recipients can access training programs using yet to come on stream government networking thing.
But that appeared to have taken the view that there's some silver bullet. My proposition is that this is a long-standing, serious, endemic problem.
No, yeah, and what's my point? I think it needs to have a wide-ranging. That's why you don't look at, say, the grades alone. I think the grades are incidental to the entire thing. You look at the entire system, every aspect of it. Teacher training, disparity in income, and how it affects placement, how it affects the quality of education delivered. There's anecdotal evidence to show that the lessons issue is becoming increasingly endemic, not just in public schools, by the way, but also within the private school system. That needs to be regularized, in the sense that if it is, 10 years ago, there was a situation at Queen's College where an IT teacher would not turn up for classes, but would refer the students to a privately held computer course, and everything that was supposed to have been taught in the classroom was taught at the privately run computer thing. And if it is you didn't go to the privately run class,
establishment of facility, yeah,
you'd fail the thing. I think the situation in many cases, and that wasn't anomalous back then, I think in many cases it's widened throughout the entire system.
As a society, are we prepared to put enough money into education?
No, we're not prepared to put enough money into education. You can look at what's happening now. You know, people look at your book sales, for example. You said you sold just over 100 copies. People aren't interested in educational material. They're not interested in literature. They're interested in entertainment. Why that happens, I prefer not to go into that right now. But in terms of solutions, Ruel just pointed out that we need to get technology incorporated into the education system and work parallelly to get somewhere. Now, I remember a couple of years ago, the government had launched, in partnership with some private entity, a CIT program. It was some sort of technology-based initiative where they were going into public schools, setting up IT labs, and giving children access to computers and technology. Now it has been more than 5 years, I think, since that first launch. I have never heard anything about this CIT ever again. One of the schools, the Diamond Secondary School, I believe it is, their IT lab is there. I recently spoke to a teacher from there. She says, well, they're using it, but what are they using it to do? How effective has it been? So you see where we are. We're implementing, but in terms of maintaining this system, keeping the system going and getting it to the end result that we want it to, it's not happening.
We three of us are from the University of Guyana, of course. At the talk I gave the other day,
Yes.
I suggested we should have a return to national service to instill some discipline. To deal with this issue, yes, people have a right to free education, nursery to university. Should we rethink our position on national service?
I think it should be a broader view of national service, in the sense that
Not military service, I'm talking about national service here.
well, there was national service as we knew it. I believe it was
Paramilitary.
a quasi paramilitary thing. I think a much broader definition of national service needs to be put in place. I'm a writer. I mean, I think my talents are in writing.
So,
Farming at Kimbia will not. My farming at Kimbia will not add value to any system. What I can do is, as part of, as a test case, what I believe I can do, as part of my contribution to national service, is to go into communities, and help at-risk youth or whatever with their writing skills. And that we need to, if it is, we're going to have a broad concept of national service. I think it needs to be broadened from what previously was, in which it mixes, in which the term national service to the nation needs to be the core concept, and which we find creative ways of having the participants give to the best of their ability to the nation.
you know, students at the University of Guyana are talking free education, and quite frankly, paying what, $127,000 per year. That's about not a hell of a lot of money. $600 US. Would you, if fees were removed and you were asked, within what Mr. Johnson is saying, national service in the broader sense, giving back to your country, like 2-3 years service, would you be prepared to do it? Do you think your generation of students would be prepared to do it?
Well, that's interesting because...
Well, you can answer for yourself at least.
Exactly, that's what I'm going to say. On my point of view, I think that I would be prepared to give at least 3 years to my country. I would be prepared to give 3 years to persons who actually need it. I mean, if I have something of value that I can share with someone of this country, of my community, of wherever, and I'm in a position to offer that at whatever cost it is to me, and I'm able to do that, I am willing to do that, because I don't believe in necessarily having knowledge and not being able to share it, or even if it's not knowledge, if you have something that you are in a position to disperse and help a fellow person, I think everybody should be prepared to do it at some time.
What about your revolutionaries?
Well, you know, Mr. Ram, the connotations of that very term, national service, especially historically, what it represents to me, what I am too young to have ever experienced anything near to national service. So I've heard stories about national service.
Yeah, but Ruel has redefined it. I mean,
are we working with your definition, Ruel?
No.
Are we working with his definition? On those grounds, I do believe in service to country, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'll speak on behalf of my colleagues on campus. I believe that majority of the students on campus are just lazy. They have barely any.
Speaking on behalf of them or against them?
Well, I am going out on a limb here, and I'm going to speak the truth. Maybe I should clarify myself. This is an opinion, and this is based on observations. You know, young people on campus are going through motions where country and identity means next to nothing to them. They don't understand the value of service. So if you're going to be asking people who don't understand the meaning of service and duty for service to country, they're not going to be able to answer you. They're not going to be able to give you anything.
Well, let me put it another way. Think of the ordinary taxpayers of this country. They're paying to fund that university. They're paying for your education. And as soon as you graduate, you say goodbye, Guyana. Is that fair?
You see, the thing is, and again, the ordinary taxpayer is very often, by the way, inclusive of university students.
Yes.
And the ordinary taxpayer is the sort of person who has an outward view of
how do we change that?
systems. I think we need to have, first of all, a very broader sense, restoration of some semblance of law and order in Guyana, in which people believe that if it is that they contribute to something, that there's if they contribute X, at the end of it there's going to be Y result. If there's a general issue with law and order in Guyana, nobody's going to buy into that system, and that it may not be so much laziness as disillusionment with the system that exists. So they're just biding their time, going through the motions, and because there's no predictability, I guess. And people, in order for people to give to the nation, they must know that what they're giving, there's some fruition to it. And then you fix systems throughout, including education, but in larger society, in which there can be reasonable results to honestly intended actions.
What do young people feel? What do university people feel about the leadership of this country? And leadership in the broader sense, the government, the opposition, civil society, the accountants, the lawyers. What do they feel about it?
Well, for me, and being a part of the young people of this country, holistically, I think our leadership is lacking in a lot of ways, because it's not coherent. We find each other being pulled in one direction as against in the other direction. And I don't think that is the way that we are going to move forward. I mean, I hear politicians talking about progressing, but if we are going to progress as a people, we have to progress together. So if we're going to weigh somebody else's thoughts, and then somebody else is going to rebut that, and we're going to keep going back and forth on an issue that we really should put our heads down and resolve. I don't think that the leadership is coherent and focused enough in the future to take us towards a better future. I think we need more cooperation, we need more negotiations, we need more compromise. And compromise is not a word that much of our politician is aware of. I mean, it's either we have it one way or the other way, and I don't think that is the way that we should. That is not the way that is going to take us forward. We need to come up with a better way. We need to fix things.
Do you have a dim view of the leadership of this country? Broad leadership.
Broad leadership. When we're talking broad leadership, the whole point of leadership, I believe, especially what I hope to gain from leadership, is an example. I need leaders to give me direction.
You get it.
I don't feel I get direction from leaders. I can't wake up and think off the top of my head 10 examples of proper role models. And leaders ultimately should serve as role models for young people. And I need role models, more role models. I've got a few, but it's not enough.
All right, let's switch now. I'm going to ask you to do your piece, the piece you did at Ruel's launch. And I think viewers, you'll find this very interesting. It's unsurprising.
Okay, the piece is called Apologetic. I'm sorry Barnum banned butter, split peas, cheese, pickled meats, and saltfish. I'm sorry about his padded voters list, proxy ballots, the rigged elections, and the referendum. I'm sorry he changed the Constitution with it. I'm sorry for his supremacy and the people who suffered by his hand or on his watch. I'm sorry I have to watch the shadow of this man still haunt this land like a plague. I'm sorry, and I wish to make it clear, I was not born then, I did not know him, and I'm tired of time traveling to 1992 and before to settle scores. I am sure my mother loved Cheddy Jagan. I know this because she cried when he died. I'm sorry his parade to the promised land was at hand and he had to go. No more than 8 or so, I stood on a pave and waved at the motorcade. I'm sorry everyone was so sad, but I don't think that he was a bad president. I'm sorry for the failures of his successor, and bad is an understatement. I'm sorry we were showered with 12 hard years of his reign and it still won't let up, but my people, don't you give up. I'm sorry we weren't ready for his rants and the ranks with orders to shoot to kill. I'm sorry for whosoever thought he fit the bill of Commander-in-Chief. His name should be written in gold leaf on the right hand of Burnham. I'm sorry for the people who were martyred, marginalized, or oppressed. I'm sorry for the people who still keep their addresses a secret in order to get hired. I'm sorry so many children know the difference between a squib and gunshots fired. I'm sorry there are so many shots of their fathers on the news, at bars, on benches, or behind bars. I am truly sorry for my brothers. I'm also sorry for my sisters and the newborn babies without mothers. I'm sorry this healthcare system means you have to bleed profusely first. I'm sorry for the first minority government, opposition parliament, and this political system. I'm sorry we are still a state in transition to socialism according to our constitution. I'm sorry the budget is sometimes full of fluff, bullet points, and statistics, and the people will not oppose it and pick it. Instead, give us a ticket to Texas and lose us. We know how to survive in a cowboy town. I'm sorry the people of the mining town were gunned down and there are no ballistic tests for the bullets pumped in their chests and elsewhere. I'm sorry that where I come from, we can now calculate the currency conversion of a soul. I'm sorry this whole controversy still stinks like a rainy day in the city of Georgetown. I'm sorry the diplomats have to remind us to take out the trash. I'm sorry for some of the trash that escapes the lips of the people seated in our highest offices. I'm sorry our mouths can no longer murmur the lyrics of that calypso. I'm sorry, but I still know my God don't sleep. I'm sorry we are forced to protest so much. I'm sorry some of us feel cheated, defeated, and damned. I'm sorry we want a better life than the one on this dam. I'm sorry that we are so divided, more ethnically than by rivers or highways. I'm sorry that this poem might be more than what we are willing to admit today, but I will still write and pray for the emancipation of our minds, and my pen will be ready to bleed for the revolution anytime.
Thank you so very much.
Yeah.
You're a critic. How do you rate that?
I think I first heard Chricell recite a thing at Upscale Restaurant, their poetry night, and in terms of the two ways I rate it. In terms of her technical capacity, I mean, there is a fledgling capacity, almost a virtuosity when it comes to the rhyming and the technical construction of the poem. But equally as important, or perhaps more important, is that what you have is somebody who is a product of this time, who is dealing with not just current contemporary life in Ghana, but the historical things that presaged it, and dealing with it frontally and evenly, which for me, which is important. This is something that, as a writer, I believe our generation, more people in our generation, need to do, and do it without any sort of inherent bias or prejudice, in which you examine, we can say, the two phases of our post-independent history and pronounce upon it, which is, as for me, that's why I asked you to read the poem at the book launch.
Well, I'm just an ordinary accountant. I call myself a bookkeeper. So, but I'm absolutely amazed that it's 45 years at least of history that has been captured
within the poem.
In that poem. That is, I mean, just a thought. Forget the quality itself. Just putting it together. How did you come up with that yourself?
Well, I wrote it post-election, last election, and I went back to the time of Burnham because it always comes up around election. That time always presents itself, and I hear a lot of 1992. It's in a lot of speeches and all these things, and I get the sense that
even Ruel talks about early October 1992.
Yes, and I get the sense that some of us are still there in 1992, and we haven't transitioned to this present day that we're having here, and we're not looking into the future, but we're rather scared of the past, and we're just stuck there. So I want to, and I feel as though that persons probably think that they need somebody to own up to whatever happened back then. I don't. And I think that all of us should say, well, okay, we are aware that there were certain things that happened, and they were not necessarily right, and we're ready to move forward from here. And that is what I think needs to happen, because a lot of people are still grieving from 1992.
Have you published it? Anyway?
No, I haven't.
Are you planning to publish it?
I didn't at the time, and I am not right now.
You have a difficult act to follow.
Well, good thing I'm from a different genre. But a quick word on her poem. When I heard it the first time at Ruel's launch, I realized something, and it was ironic. The older people always speak about the past, and they expect somebody to apologize to them.
That is
and
true.
when she stood up and apologized, oh, it hit home.
Well, I sat there. I was fortunate to be invited, and I sat there and I thought, where is she going with this? You know, I mean, it was such a beautiful commencement of it, and quite frankly, it was emotional as well. I think every Guyanese ought to empathize with that, and I want to publicly congratulate you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you all.
Go on, Sara.
Yes, so my piece is entitled...
Wait, just for readers.
Yes.
Both presentations were made at Ruel Johnson's book. I don't know why. He didn't even want to read a paragraph of his book. The guy is so modest. Genuinely so, I hope.
For me, as I told Sara and I told Chricell, it wasn't just the launch of the books in themselves, as in my books and the content, particularly, and this is something we dealt with last time I was here, with regard to the condemnatory remarks made about local writers and what they're producing, and particularly because what I did was start up not just the publications, but publications come out of what I'm now registering as a publishing company, publishing house. I wanted to show the people gathered there, and eventually the rest of Guyana, that young people writing in this country have the capacity to produce good work, and this is work that's being produced without the sort of infrastructure that I've been calling for the past 10 years. If it is that we have that in place, Chricell should be published, Sara should be published, and there are easily, I know, 1,000 more young people who are producing good work here. So,
well, I think they both appreciate the opportunity you gave for them to make that to a public audience. Let's hear you.
Alright, so the piece is called The News Reporter, and I'm going to read you an excerpt. Is the news reporter the offspring of a vulture and a leech? Or is she or he singularly responsible for corrupting the pure words parted from the mouths of the nation's greatest minds? Can the news reporter fear the news more than the taxman fears the lie detector test? Does the news reporter abandon truth to attain a seaside mansion? Where, when, and how does the news reporter live? Who is the news reporter? The news reporter is me, and I am the news reporter. Why should anything else matter? Would anyone believe that my greatest fear is becoming the news? Could they guess that I only learned this truth about myself while the man I loved tried to strangle the life out of me? Perhaps a single headline could have become the brightest symbol of my life. Crime reporter strangled. Guyana Guardian crime reporter Samaria Prasad was strangled to death by her fiancé last night. In a statement, police reported that Prasad, 21, was found dead at her fiancé's Georgetown home shortly after 8 p.m. According to them, the dead woman's fiancé called police at Rheinbelt to report that he had murdered his intended wife. When police arrived at the scene, the statement further said the man was found lying in bed with the deceased. If that had been my fate, then what else would the article have said? Would it mention the people I left to mourn? Perhaps it would mention my mother, the gentle woman who hated my job more than she hated our country's black and Indian politics. Or if my mother was so insignificant an identity, then it would most certainly mention my father, the army pilot whose plane crashed into one of the beautiful mountains in the hinterland. Surely it would recognize my great service and sacrifice, surely.
Comment? You're the critic here.
No, but no, again, it's beautiful for me. It's and a couple of things. One, it's beautiful prose, and subtly, not even subtly, and naturally woven into it, as it should be. Is a sort of Guyanese ethos that the work draws directly upon. I mean, the issue of domestic violence, the issue of corruption, the issue of press freedom, all that informs specifically our particular state or particular social environment. And that, for me, that, and listening to it, it's in a different way. I mean, two different genres, but they're two equally powerful, as short as they were, equally powerful pieces of writing that, and which is why I'm going, which was I said with regard to the connection that the students can make to literature, that brings literature home to them. And if it is that 5 years from now, we could have the poem and the story on the school curriculum, I think the young person who's reading it is going to score a much higher English grade than if they're reading from work that they're not directly connected to. Granted that there is capacity, there is space for the classics, and there's a role for the classics, Shakespeare, etc. Another dimension to this is that, and this is something that impacts upon me personally, is that what I found is that women are at the forefront of writing in India, young women. More than they are young men. if you could give us some of the, for me, the upcoming writers in Guyana, they are primarily, with about one or two exceptions. There's Edison Jefford and Kojo McPherson. Edison Jefford, Kojo Mac, and James Bond, parliamentarian James Bond, who's been shortlisted for the Guyana Prize, and two of whom may be shortlisted again this year. The strongest writers are female writers. It's just they take less risks and they're more reticent in putting the work out there. But pound for pound, the talent exists with women writers.
What inspired?
My life inspired this, Mr. Ram. My life did. The character was partly based on all the frustrations I had collected over a period of years, because I was in the media for a few years, and I realized that generally media practitioners seemed to didn't take enough pride in what they did, for whatever reason it was, and because they lacked this integrity, people did not take a lot of them seriously. And people also were not aware of the struggles of a news reporter, that they had an identity behind this title of news reporter. And then to take it to a different level, not only is the character a news reporter, but she's a woman. And how does a Guyanese woman handle the elements of the society? And she's a Guyanese woman, but she's also suffering from the violence present in the society. She's being abused. She is psychologically troubled. And so many women, so many Guyanese women are in similar positions, and yet they function on a day-to-day basis in a society that just doesn't see beneath the surface.
All right, we've spent lots of time talking around the subject. Ruel, you have two books, fictions and collected poems. I want to ask you this question. Now, don't tell me about doggerel and popperel and rhymes, please. But these days you read a poem and you're not sure which should rhyme, if it should rhyme at all. Whether it should line up, and when I was at school we used to say about stanza and all. How does one read poetry now?
And I'm giving some poetry classes that start off with a very basic concept. Poetry is the control, the cohesion of two basic elements. One is sound and one is meaning. Rhyme is just incidental to the quality of sound within a poem. So if it is that a poem has a certain rhythm and there may not be a single rhyming pair of words in the poem, but once there's a rhythm to it, and once there's meaning to the piece of work, at a very basic that it's a poem.
Could you give me an example by just reading maybe one?
I can read a very simple poem.
Yes, please. And ladies, please help me.
And usually what I aim for is sort of a layered meaning in each poem, because a poem is about economy of words. You use as little words as possible to express as much meaning. And I read a very simple one. This is one from a series called After Carter, which is a reference to Martin Carter. And it's called Of Shape. And they say that if you wish to know the true shape of a heart, fold your fist. That's the poem. That is the complete poem.
Complete poem.
Well, it's part of a series, but
yes.
There are a series of mini poems. So that in itself functions as a poem.
It tells a whole story, though.
It has. You said if you wish, fist. There's a little thing to rhyme, etc., but it's not necessary to rhyme outright. There's some poems in there which are very structured with regard to rhyme, etc.
You also have, I noticed some of the lines are very long, some are very short. And that again is the issue of the song.
The line is part of how you construct sound in a poem. Although when I write, some poems I have a fair amount of internal rhyming. In the very first poem in the book, I have a sort of staggered rhyme, in which the rhyming word that recurs in the poem, in the 4 stanzas, the rhyming sound, moves from line 1 in the first stanza, then goes to line 2 in the second, and line 3 in the third, and finally ends at line 4 in the 4 stanza poem, which is a sort of deliberate construction.
How many poems are in this book?
Good question. I figure about 32 roughly.
And it's collected. Is it collected? I mean, is this your first?
It's my first poetry publication. In 2002, I mean, I won the, and by the way, I reissued the 10th anniversary edition of the Ariadne and Other Stories, which won the Ghana Prize 10 years ago. But I was also shortlisted for a collection of poetry called The Enormous Night, which I never published. So what I essentially did in collected poems is I took some of the poems from The Enormous Night, some of the better ones that I won't feel embarrassed looking at, and I put some of them together with poems that I would have written over the past 10 years and issued my first poetry publication, which is collected poems, 2002 to 2012.
Very briefly, the book on fictions.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them very short.
Yes.
What's the how do you explain that? You explain the poetry in a different sense, but how do you explain it in the terms of fiction and stories?
And for me, fiction, prose fiction is as close for me. It's very close to poetry in terms of the fact there's an economy of words, and you have to also put in as much meaning as possible into a very short space of time. There's less of an emphasis on sound, except when you look at stuff like rhythm in the sentence, which is something completely different with writing. But you don't have to focus so much on the sound of it in a structured way. But what you do is focus so much on meaning and what I call the thesis of the work. And with fictions, what I did, I mean, there are stories that are entirely in. There's one story that's a chat message. There's another story that you
chat
see
meaning
a computer chat,
yes.
like a transcript of a computer chat message, which refers to another story in the book that directly comes after it. There is a story that is just basically like a dialogue. The characters aren't identified by name. There's a story that it's basically not a transcript almost of an interview, except you don't see the questions being asked, and you just get the answers.
So there's lots of subtlety in this.
Yeah, what I try to do, and by the way, a lot of it, the bulk of it, in terms of form, is not necessarily original. I mean, the question and answer format.
But it's pretty new to Ghana literature, isn't it?
It is, and that's part of the point of why I write. I mean, we have this thing wherein we have the sort of cliche both of form and content. We have the cliche of content in the sense that we will all look at mango trees and rivers and all that, and the cliche of form in which we look at a sort of a completely linear narrative. X happened, Y at the trench side, blah blah blah. What I want to show that Guyanese writing from this particular socio-cultural perspective and contemporary perspective can produce with both form and content writing that could fit anywhere else in the world, and even as we think it's so
okay. Probably novel in the novel sense of the word as well. Where do people get these books to buy?
Austin's bookstore, or from me, and just two places.
And the price?
This one is the two new books are $3,000 each, and the older one is $2,500. I have a hell of a printing bill, and I have debts that I would have incurred while producing the book. Writing is hard work.
So viewers, if you want to help, and they're two good books, but you will help Ruel with his meeting his printing bill as well. Yeah. These books are self-published, so he has met all the risks of the publication. Let me say, Miss Bharrat, Miss Whitney, Mr. Ruel Johnson, thank you very much for appearing on Plain Talk this evening. I thought it was an interesting discussion, and the poem and the story, I thought, really very interesting.
Yeah.
And I hope the viewers will think so as well. Next week I'll have Mr. Dr. Henry Jeffrey, and we'll discuss crisis or not in the education system. I'll try to get the Chief Education Officer to join us in that discussion. Operators and viewers, thank you. Good night. See you next week.